Welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java Programming video. This is the last video in this unit before you're going to start working on your pizza project. Once again, the pizza project is a project where you're going to make an application that simulates a pizza order form that's going to allow a user to choose a certain number of toppings and a size for pizza, submit that pizza, and it will print out a receipt in a text area. The application that I have on the screen right now sort of simulates that just a little bit. I've got some checkboxes over here on the side that I can check and uncheck. I've got a series of radio buttons on the top where I can choose a choice. And then I've got a submit button, which would then print out the state in that text area. So you can see it says check 2 chosen, radio 3 chosen. If I update the state and I submit, it'll show you that updated state. Check 2 chosen, check 3 chosen, radio 3 chosen. And I can spam this in any way I want, keep changing those choices until I get a state that I want and click submit, and it'll give me the correct output. One of the problems that people have oftentimes with this project is that they don't have the selecting and deselecting thing quite down, and it's hard for them to show the output of the exact state of their buttons and their GUI. So we're going to look at one technique for doing that using Boolean flags. I'm going to preface this by saying that this is not necessarily the most elegant or best technique for doing this, but I'm going to tell you that it's one of the easiest ways of doing it, and it's building upon some previous knowledge that we already have. So that's why we're doing it this way. Let's look at the code. The class is called multiple listeners, and it is a JFrame. It implements both action listener and item listener. Action listener for the button, item listener for the checkboxes and radio buttons. You can have as many listeners implemented on your class as you want. I've got a huge GUI here. I've got buttons, text area, radio buttons, a button group. I've got checkboxes. I've got a bunch of panels. I've got something called a JScroll pane, which we'll talk about. And I've got a string for output text. And then I have a series of Booleans that I'm going to use as flags to help us see which buttons are chosen and which ones are not chosen. Look at the main. We've got our instantiation of the frame, we've got the size set, the layout set to border, and we've got our GUI, and we've got our set visible. In create GUI, I've got it fully decomposed because, once again, this is an absolutely huge GUI. It's not enormous. I mean, it's bigger than anything that we've done so far. So it's going to have a lot of code to build this up. And because it's got a lot of code to build that GUI, we really need to decompose that. We need to break each component down into its own method. There, our create GUI method can then be much more well-organized and clearer and easier to read. So set up radios, set up checks, set up buttons, set up output, register checks, register radios, and register buttons. Let's look at set up radios and set up checks. Here's setup checks. I've got my checkbox panel, which has a grid layout to it. It's a 3-row by 1-column grid layout. I've got my 3 checks, 1, 2, and 3. I've got my checkbox panel, which I add all my checks to. And then I add the checkbox panel to the border layout west. All right? And you can see that's right there. Let's look at the radios. Set up radios. I've got a button group. I create my 3 radio buttons. I get my radios J panel and set it to a flow layout because it's just across the top and I want them to flow. Suppose I could have done that as a box layout too and set it along the x-axis. I add all my radio buttons to the group, and then I add the 3 radio buttons to the radios panel, and then add the radios panel to border layout north. Then I register my radio buttons. Set up output. This is where we've got something new, so I'll spend a little bit more time looking at this. Output panel is a J panel. I've got my text area, which is 7 rows by 25 columns. I set my line wrap to true, as we saw in a previous video, and set word wrap style to true, so that it's going to wrap when it gets to the end of a line, and it's going to wrap only at full words. It's not going to break words apart. Then I've got something called a scroll pane. As you saw in a previous video, text areas don't by default have a scroll bar. So what happens when you add too much text is the text area just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, that would, really break a layout. So what we want to do is, instead of making the text area bigger, we want to add some scroll bars to the side so we can scroll up and down through that text if the text area gets too big. I'm going to set layout to flow layout on the output panel, and then I'm going to add the scroll pane to the output panel and add the output panel to the frame. Now, here is what's kind of counterintuitive about this. When we think of scroll bars, we think those scroll bars are actually added to the text area, but they're not. If you look here carefully, when we instantiate the scroll pane, we're adding the output panel or the output text area to it. So output is a J text area. It's by default 7 by 25. Now, the scroll pane is called scroll. What we're doing is that output panel that's 7 rows high is going to get added to that scroll pane. And that scroll pane is going to be just big enough to have 7 rows in it. And what's going to happen if our text area gets too big? It's going to add more rows, but those rows will be hidden below the bottom or the top of the scroll pane. And then a scroll bar will appear, which allows us to pan up and down over that text area, thereby revealing more of the text in the text area, making it look like it's scrolling up and down. Let's take a look at how that happens. I'm just going to keep, oh wait, the way I've got this set up, it's not going to do it. I'm going to modify something really quickly. And that's going to be in action performed, wherever that is. There we go. I will go append. Add my checks, choose that, submit, 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 submit. And what you see here is the scroll bars are added. And those scroll bars are allowing the text area to be revealed within this scroll pane. So the scroll pane is containing our text area. Right now our text area is partially hidden up here and partially hidden down here. And when I go up, it's scrolling that text area down to reveal itself within the scroll pane. Okay? So it's not actually a scroll bar that's added to the text area. It's a text area that's added to the scroll pane. Let's go back down to that. Set up text, set up output. So there we go. We create our text area. We do the line wrap stuff. We create our scroll pane, adding the text area to it. Set our layout to flow on the output panel. And then we add the scroll pane to the output panel and the output panel to the frame. Lastly, we set up buttons. And there's nothing special about this. It's just adding those buttons and setting the flow layout to the panel, adding the panel. Lastly, register the buttons. All right, so we've got our whole GUI created. Let's take a look at how it is interactive. That's going to lead me to the item state changed first, because the item state changed is the big one. This one is going to set up our Boolean state. So it's going to look at all those checkboxes and radio buttons and set true and false the things that are checked or unchecked. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check a deselected event and a selected event. So I get my source here, and if state changed is deselected. In other words, if that event that came into this method was done by deselecting something, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check what the source is, and I'm going to set false the Boolean that's associated with that source. So if check 1 was deselected, in other words, if it was the source was check 1 and the event was a event that took the check away from that box, an unchecked event or deselected event, it's going to set check 1 chosen to false. So I'm using those Boolean flags, flipping them true or false, depending on if it's being selected or deselected. So if the source was check 1, it's false. Check 2 chosen is false. Check 3 chosen is false. Choice 1 chosen is false. Choice 2 chosen is false. Choice 3 chosen is false. And then I've got a call to a return. All right, this isn't necessarily the best way of doing it, but it is a way of doing it. What return does is it forces the method to terminate. Because if it's deselected event, I want to just be done with everything when I get to this point. Okay? So deselect it, it's going to finish. Now here, I've got an if clause checking if the choice was choice 1. And if that's the case, I'm going to set it to true. And this is going to be for all selected events here. Because if they're not deselected, then by default, they're going to be selected. Another way we could do this is we could bury these things inside of an else, and then that would take care of it being a selected event. It would look kind of like this. Else, and then nest all these in there. Okay? And then I wouldn't have to do this return there. But I'm not going to do that for now. So what this is going to do is checking the radio events. If choice 1 is chosen, so if I click on that, it's going to set it to true. Else, if it's choice 2, it'll set radio 2 chosen to true. Else, if it's choice 3, radio 3 chosen is true. Here I'm setting up checking the checkbox events. And in these, remember, they can be, the event will happen whether it's selected or deselected. So what I want to do is I want to see what the source is, and I want to make sure that it's currently selected instead of being unselected. So if source is check 1 and check 1 is selected, check 1 chosen is true. And I'm going to go through all 3 of the checks and do the same thing. So that's setting up our Boolean state here. Okay, now this isn't the only way to set the logic up in here, but I think this is a way of setting up the logic for beginning students to understand it the most easily. There are other ways of doing it that are going to make it more complex, and you have to think through the logic a little bit more, but I want to do it as simply and clearly as possible. Now, once that's done, we have to build an output string, because here's what happens. After you do that and set up your state, you're going to press one of your buttons. So we do our checks and stuff like that. We press submit. And when we press submit, it's going to look at the state, and then it's going to build an output string. Okay? That output string is going to be used to draw to this text area here. So on action performed, when a button is pressed, we're going to check and see if it's submit or clear. If it's submit, we're going to build the output string, and then we're going to either append the text or set the text. I had it like this to start. I had set text. And when I run it with set text, as we saw, it just replaces the text that was there. When we run it with append text, it adds on to the text that was there. So that's the difference between set text and append text on a text area. Append means add to the end. Set replaces. So I'm going to build my output string, set the text to the output, and then I'm going to clear out that output text so that it's fresh and clear next time I want to paste it on there. Well, let's look at the build output string method, because that's the one that's going to look at our Boolean state and build a string based on that state. Here it is. Build output string is just going to use a non-exclusive choice through a series of ifs. Any of these ifs that are true, it's going to concatenate a message to that string. Okay? So if only one of them is true, it's, let's say, only check 2 is chosen. It's going to skip over that, and then it's going to add this to the string. It's going to skip over the rest, and then it's going to be done. And then when we build the output string, check 2 chosen is the only thing that'll draw to the text area. So what I'm doing here is I'm using that Boolean state. I'm checking all those Boolean variables, and for every one that's true, we're going to add that thing to the output string. And there you have it. We've put together all the skills that we've used in these videos so far. What I want you to try and do with this is I want you to see if you can come up with a better way to design this program. Maybe keep the Booleans and then change how item state changed works. See if you can use selected and deselected a little bit better. See if you can use is selected and source better than I do. Try and use all those three states in some way to do this so that you can simplify this whole setup in item state changed. That's a challenge for you. If you can get that down, then see if you can figure out a way of doing this whole thing without the Boolean flags. That could be an interesting challenge, and I think it's one that'll be a little bit tougher to think through, but I think you have it in you. Now you have all the skills that you need to do your pizza order form project. Thanks for watching.